Let's get to some listener questions. Given the current political landscape, do you think there will be another coalition government in 2029? And would the UK benefit from switching to a proportional representation system rather than first past the post?
So I think it's quite possible that we have quite dramatic shifts at the next election. Remember that the last election, the result was very much sort of product of our bizarre electoral system. Labour won this giant majority, but on a very small vote share. And it looks as though running into the next election in England, we're going to have potentially 4 parties, not that different from each other, and lots of very strange local contests. And that's one of the things that's making the political strategists, I think, probably lose some sleep, which contests they have to be focusing on. So I think running into that, it's going to be a bit of a pollster nightmare. That's good. Might need to give the pollsters something to think about rather than a sort of slam dunk and just how big is the majority going to be. Whether we get a coalition, I think, is interesting. There are alternative arrangements. We saw that with Theresa May in 2017 when she opted for that thing called a confidence and supply agreement with the Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists. That's another possibility, that you do a more limited deal. We've seen Nicola Sturgeon govern in Scotland with a minority, probably harder to do. In Westminster, you might not want to have to negotiate all your legislative programme item by item in quite the same way. I think one of the things that was really interesting, though, with our electoral system, it comes on to the second part, is we saw the Liberal Democrats get absolutely hammered to bits in 2015. There's a general rule about coalition governments that the junior partner in coalitions does quite badly at the subsequent election, and particularly if you don't have the protection of proportional representation or some alternative electoral system, you are very, very vulnerable. And that's why the Liberal Democrats saw their representation in Parliament reduced from 50, 60 to under 10 or wherever they went. I mean, it was a
small
really
enough
bad
that they
election.
could all fit in a minibus.
It was a really bad election. It's back to the sort of, the 60s or whatever, the Liberal Democrats. So I think, lots of junior partners will be wary. Interesting question, I think, about whether any smaller party might demand something better than a referendum or alternative voting as the price for going into a coalition to give them a degree of protection. So, electoral systems, what are the pros and cons? The pro of our current electoral system is, yes, it's unfair. Yes, it produces some results that look quite absurd. We've seen the number of people it takes to get a Reform or Green MP elected versus the number of people it takes to get a Labour MP or an SNP MP elected, and it's massively out of kilter. It's a very disproportionate outcome that we saw this time in 2024. Its virtue is supposed to be that it gives us a strong and stable, who said that, government that can elect. You choose the manifesto. They don't then have to negotiate. We've just seen Germany negotiating for a couple of months after their election to get their government in place. So, and people last time round didn't seem to like our parties doing deals after an election. I don't think that's quite in our culture yet. So you get a strong majority and they can then basically sail through. That said, in quite recent elections, it's not been that good at doing that. We saw in 2017 that sort of knife-edgy result. In 2010, we didn't get a majority. That's why we ended up with the coalition. So maybe our electoral system isn't producing the goods now. And if a sort of 4-party in England, 4-5-party system in Scotland and Wales is really here to stay, then I think it's really interesting about whether you don't want an electoral system that actually isn't a lottery. Because I think next time round, for all political correspondence, it's going to be really fun time, but it is going to be a bit of a lottery. You put your figures in and then see what shakes out at the result. New Zealand changed their electoral system, not because either of the major political parties wanted to do it, because actually they tend not to be very in favour of changing the electoral system, but because the electoral system produced the wrong result 2 or 3 times in a row, and there was a sort of popular move saying, this system just doesn't work anymore and we'll have to change it. And so they moved to their electoral system, the multi-member system, I think a bit like the one they've used in Scotland. So where you get 2 votes. So I think it will probably come back on the cards, but we'll then have to change our culture and get used to parties being prepared to do deals afterwards, that actually what you're voting for in a manifesto, you're likely to be able to vote for the party you really want, rather than just have to sort of game who's likely to be in contention. But you may have to then accept that backroom deals after an election, and quite a long wait for governments to be formed, is then going to become part of the political landscape.
It's really interesting. One of the things that I was speaking to a couple of strategists for different political parties, and one of the things that I've heard a couple of times is that when you've got 3 parties on 22 to 25%, which is what we've currently got, it's really difficult, as you say, to like plug that into a model and go, oh, this is how many seats they'll win, because small changes can make a huge difference. And I was speaking to somebody from Reform who suggested that Reform need to get from 25 just to 33. And if the electorate stays that fractured, 33% for any party could be enough to potentially get a majority government, or could not, because it depends whether those votes stack up. I would remind listeners that when we were doing our predictions for 2025, one of my predictions for this year was that the question over voting systems, electoral reform, proportional representation was going to become a bigger issue this year, with both the Lib Dems and Reform challenging the status quo.
I think the interesting thing is whether the Conservatives ever convert to supporting electoral reform with their sort of polling numbers. At the moment, that might be quite an interesting issue, because you do see people who are disbenefited by the system. Actually, finally, at the last election, the Liberal Democrats actually managed to get the sort of right proportions of votes to seats by a very efficient system. That's the big sort of Morgan McSweeney buzzword nowadays, is voter efficiency. You've got to actually make sure you get the votes in the right places. I think another big benefit, actually, if you want to look at benefits of electoral reform, is at the last election, no one really bothered to campaign in my seat, even though it was a Conservative seat that switched to Labour, because they knew that actually Labour was going to walk it, particularly after boundaries had been redrawn a bit. So, we could have forgotten the election was happening in my seat, and I don't think that's great for democracy. I think one of the other things is, I know we were really down on alternative voting when we got that option back in 2011, but I think it's really interesting. One of the things that people say, looking now at Australia, which has that system, is to say one of the effects of that is that combined with compulsory voting, which they also have in Australia, which I think is another thing that some people see merit in, is that basically it pulls the parties a bit more towards the centre, because they have to appeal to the people who aren't their committed voters. They need to build enough votes to get a sort of overall majority when you eliminate the other candidates. And I think maybe that's a better system than it looked when we were offered that chance back in 2011.
Speaking of democracy and elected representation, let's go to Christian, who wants to know what are the benefits and the negatives of having an elected or partially elected House of Lords. Now, I think we can all agree that if we were designing the House of Lords from scratch, it probably wouldn't look the way that it does, with some bishops and some hereditary peers, although Labour are phasing them out, and then a whole lot of failed politicians and some people who haven't turned up for many years. Do you have a defence for the House of Lords as it currently is?
So it's quite interesting. There's a book by a sort of liberalish commentator called Ian Dunt, who sort of basically likes to tear everything up from the roots and sort of shake it around. But his book argues actually that this is to paraphrase Ian, don't sue me, that the House of Lords actually is absurd, but actually quite a necessary part of our system, partly because parliamentary scrutiny, legislative scrutiny in the Commons has now got so bad. We see increasing numbers of the government increasingly frequently introducing sort of framework legislation, just saying, I'm going to do all of this by secondary legislation. Okay, MPs, don't have to worry your pretty little heads about it, rushing bills through. I mean, last week we saw that emergency legislation on the Saturday to push the steel bill through, but the government keeps on resorting to rushing bills through. And the only place where actually bills get a decent going over is in the House of Lords. And the House of Lords' merit on its current system is not, as the Conservatives are likely arguing at the moment, I think, that there are all these wonderful hereditaries who are committed and have been around since the Norman Conquest or, Tudor times, sitting on their big estates, but is actually that we do have people who have genuine expertise in areas, who can bring that expertise sometimes to bear on legislation coming through, and we would potentially lose that with an elected House of Lords. I think you have to ask, why are MPs so reluctant in many ways to propose a fully elected or a partially elected House of Lords? And I think one of the things there, and it may apply more to a fully elected one than a partially elected one, is they're worried about the legitimacy. We talk very much about, the primacy of the Commons, that, upper house, lower house, stuff like that. But it's very clear that, the Lords can ask the Commons to think again, and does, and we saw that a bit. But ultimately, the Lords realises that it's a sort of illegitimate chamber. It can ask the question, but ultimately it shouldn't force itself, onto the Commons force its views through. So I think MPs are worried that if you elected the House of Commons, what do? You elected the same system. So actually, how are they different to MPs? You maybe elect them for longer time spans and say you can only serve once. You could tweak that a bit. Or you elect them by PR, going back to the earlier question. And then the question is, well, actually, doesn't that better reflect public opinion than the Commons now? And actually, is it
where's
right?
the authority?
Yeah, so where's the authority? So I think MPs are very reluctant to, if you like, sort of make an honest house of the House of Lords. So they are annoying, but in some ways it sort of suits them to have someone where they actually know it's quite useful for sorting out some of the wrinkles in their legislation. It can be a bit annoying, but at the end of the day, the Commons usually can impose its will on the House of Lords. And I think those are the big arguments for and against. We saw proposals from Gordon Brown for something a bit more like the Bundesrat in Germany, this sort of thing that would represent the devolved assemblies and the mayoralities and things like that. But that, does that really fit in our system? Sort of bit of an odd mix. Maybe it does. So I think there are sort of, odd questions. We could move to a system with only one chamber. You do have what are called unicameral systems, only one chambers. Most people have bicameral systems. But then we really, really, really would need the Commons to up its game on looking at government legislation.
You need a check on legislation, don't you?
You need some check, because actually at the moment a government with a majority doesn't have to pay very much attention to its backbenchers. Backbenchers now are prepared to rebel more, but they do seem very, very unprotective, if you like, of their rights as MPs, very willing to cede very sweeping powers to government.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed reporting from Parliament is the quality of debates in the House of Lords is just in a different league to the quality of debates in the Commons. Because in the Commons, you just get MPs repeating variations of whatever the party line is. You do get powerful speeches, but often they're repeating the party line, or they are trying to produce a soundbite that they can clip up and put on social media. The Lords, they go through legislation like line by line with all of the, well, what about this and what about that? And they stress test it. And just if anyone listening is in and around London, you can go and you can watch House of Lords debates. You can just turn up at Parliament and say you want to go watch for half an hour. And I would just recommend that people do that, because it is pretty fascinating to watch. Okay, this question comes from Ian. And we're moving beyond Westminster now, beyond the Westminster bubble. He wants to know, what is the Labour government doing about devolution? It was a big talking point in the election that made me excited to vote Labour. It's great that Ian is excited about devolution. In February, the government announced that it was launching the devolution priority programme with 6 areas to elect mayors for the first time by May 2026. More generally, what's the point? What is it trying to achieve with devolution? What is the ambition behind all of this?
So I think this is not my real area of expertise, but very good questions. So I think there are 2 different trends going on. And I think one of the interesting questions is, how far do we go with both of those? One of those is to what's called complete the devolution map. So we've got at the moment these mayoral combined authorities, some high profile mayors. We've got some more mayors coming in and being elected this May with quite big powers, but sitting on top of sort of, councils, these combined authorities. So we're thinking of people like sort of Andy Burnham, Ben Houchen, whatever, in these big sort of mayoralities, really have established themselves quite big local figures. The idea is to try and extend that beyond those big cities and sort of, and I think so far, I don't think the mayors who aren't in the big urban areas have quite got the same profile, at least not nationally, but we're going to extend that there. And we're going to reorganise local government. So we've had local elections postponed in some areas so that councils come together in what are called unitary authorities. One of the things is that we do a lot of things a bit subscale. So we'll have bigger local government, we'll have more mayors, but it won't necessarily be that everywhere has to have a mayor. There's been some local resistance to mayors. So we'll have sort of local government reorganisation. At the same time, so that's a sort of, if you like, trying to make the patchwork that is incomprehensible local government in the UK. And yonks ago, I used to work on local government, make the current system a bit more coherent and actually not just say, you're in this bit, you have this system, you're in this bit, you have a completely different system. So look, I think a bit more uniform.
After the changes, 80% of the country will be in a devolved area. So that's over 44 million people. Yeah. So that's most people.
So we're sort of moving towards having a sort of, completed map where you've got those. Then, because the government does this sort of odd way of doing devolution where you sort of grant powers and budgets to people and they're all slightly different, slightly tweaked, there are some areas which are getting get more powers and more authority over their budget. And the real leaders there are Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, which have been part of what are called trailblazers. So they're going to get more powers and more say over their budget. So it doesn't come in little packages from government. They can actually decide how they want to send it. And Andy Burnham's always going on about actually he'd like more. He'd like much more or whatever. So I think we're getting a bit of that. I think there's some really interesting issues. One issue, I think, is about accountability of mayors. They're slightly constrained by having to work with the local authorities below them in this combined authority model. Not so much the case for Sadiq Khan, but whatever. But I think it gets really interesting about, is Andy Burnham mayor for life in Manchester if he wants to stay? Where are we going to get any sort of jeopardy or challenge in some of these areas where it's pretty nailed on that the leading party candidate will get that? And I think it's really interesting to see whether the government does make good on what was trailed a bit before the election of going back to the old system we used to have for electing mayors, to the supplementary vote. Which meant that you did have to sort of reach out and get a sort of majority there.
It used to be, now it's first past the post, and the Conservatives changed it to first past the post from the transferable vote.
Well, it used to be that you used to get 2 votes, so you had to sort of guess who was going to be in the final 2, and that's a bit of a sort of odd system.
And the Tories thought that it would help them, and now it's looking like it might not.
And I think there's an interesting question about, was that system actually more conducive to independents running and starting to challenge and things like that? So I think that's quite sort of interesting question, because you do really want some contested mayoralities rather than people guaranteeing that. But I think one of the really interesting things as well is we focus very much on the spending side of the equation and the say that mayors get over the over powers and how they spend their budgets and to what extent they're hamstrung by Whitehall on what they can spend their money on. I think the really interesting question, which no government has tried to address for decades, is local government finance. Do we give them any more authority to raise revenue locally? We've seen some skirmishes about, possible tourist taxes and things like that. Even though the government doesn't want to introduce that, can you have those locally? And some mayors making the case that they'd like some more fiscal powers. Do we do anything where actually they have to raise, very substantial sums through they have much more discretion over local taxation rather than quite constrained discretion that they have now. And I think that's a sort of interesting thing. And local government finance remains sort of, very unreformed. The council tax was introduced in the early 1990s as a rescue job after the community charge, the poll tax, was abolished, and we still use exactly the same values there. So it's values for housing there. So it's become a bit of an absurdity, but all governments just duck under the table when you talk about reforming local government finance. And it is arguable that if you really, really want sort of proper local devolution, that should involve more discretion over revenue raising as well as more discretion over spending.